This is America's Roundtable from Washington, D.C., a weekly radio program with leading voices from America and the globe, representing the academia, business, think tanks, and the political arena. I am Joel Ansami, your co-host, joined by Natasha Srdoc, economist and chairman of the think tank Adriatic Institute and co-founder of the International Leaders Summit. This weekend, we are pleased to have as our special guest Dr. Daniel Kaufmann. Daniel Kaufmann is a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. His areas of expertise include public sector and regulatory reform, development, governance, and anti-corruption. Previously, he served as director at the World Bank Institute, leading the work on governance and anti-corruption, where he pioneered new approaches to measure and analyze governance and corruption, helping countries formulate action programs. In the early 90s, Kaufmann was the first chief of mission of the World Bank to Ukraine, and then he held a visiting position at Harvard University. Dr. Kaufmann is a member of the Advisory Board of Transparency International, and during the next month he will take up a new post as president of the Revenue Watch Institute in New York.
You have been advocating transparency-led reforms, as we already talked about it. And in your article, released in the first week of December, titled Judge Rakov Challenge to the Security Exchange Commission, Can Regulatory Capture Be Reversed?, you comment on the information made public that same week that by March 2009, the Federal Reserve had secretly provided nearly $7.8 trillion in emergency funds to rescue the financial system, dwarfing the publicly known $700 billion Troubled Asset Relief Program, so-called TARP. And you said, the trouble with this secret bailout is not the Fed's emergency actions, but rather that the information remained so closely guarded for so long and that the Fed fought against its disclosure. In line with our talk about transparency-led reforms, would you have some other suggestions and proposals?
I think it's very important to look at reforms in general and transparency-led reforms in particular as an integrated package where, depending on the context, the country, and the moment, what are the priorities and the optimal package that one has to look at? The key 5, 6 measures will depend and will vary. But that's why you are right that it's not just enough to measure one measure in transparency, which I just mentioned in campaign financing, but one would have to go through the other key dimensions of transparency. And transparency in the financial sector is crucial. This week we have been dealing with a very important issue of mandating transparency on the oil, gas, and mineral companies in terms of them disclosing what payments, what revenues do they actually pay to governments for their concession, for the leases, for the projects, which that has been in the midst of obscurity and lack of transparency for a long time. But thanks to Dodd-Frank and now the SEC is ruling on this, this is a very important also dimension of another dimension of transparency. In the financial sector, and when it comes to the Federal Reserve Board, let's keep it in mind that there is sometimes certain type of information that is not necessarily optimal to fully disclose just on time, on that moment, because it can create panic in the market. The question I raised then, why not 6 months later? Why years? Why was it basically kept under wraps and only because they were forced to disclose they disclosed? So it doesn't give a lot of confidence about the extent to which they want to be transparent. So in the case of monetary financial indicators, particularly when it comes to a central bank and Federal Reserve Board, there are best practices, not all of which suggest that you have to release all the information that very moment. And sometimes there is a reason to have the minutes and other things with some delay, whether it's a few weeks or so on, it's to debate. But it should never be a year or two.
The underlying U.S. foreign policy objective is to have functioning democracies around the world. And when we look at continental Europe and U.S., we see that they do not have the same standards when it comes to tolerance of political corruption. European companies are very often involved in bribing government officials, and money laundering by European banks are perpetuating political corruption in Southeast Europe. OECD, as it was published in Financial Times, OECD calls Austria an oasis of corruption. And there are a number of evidences that are confirming that. There's also a small principality of Liechtenstein, which continues to launder money through its banking system owned by the royal family, as published in media reports, including the recent article published in Die Zeit, German media. On the other side, we have a U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is having ad hoc results, going after companies bribing government officials. And there were some companies that were indicted. Among others, there were Daimler Chrysler, Deutsche Telekom, Pfizer, Siemens. But the question is, what can Americans do to strengthen the rule of law and bring the countries of the Western world under the same standards and premises? And there is a significant merit to that. When you think about everybody having the same cost of compliance, there also is no point of aiding the countries whose government officials park their corrupt funding in OSCE, such as Austria, Liechtenstein. And the third point being that why should the taxpayers be bailing out the countries whose elites are corrupt? So again, back to the question, what do you think, what can Americans do to strengthen the rule of law and bring the countries of the Western world under the same standard and premises?
Well, there are very interesting presumptions in your question. I think the whole notion that the U.S. is so far ahead from other countries and Europe on these has been challenged over the past few years, and particularly in the context not only of the Wall Street-led financial crisis, which exposed deep governance flaws in the United States, but also enormous scandals related to Madoff and some company giants that were involved in massive fraud and corruption and went under, a la Enron and WorldCom. Of course, Italy and other countries had their own. So basically, there has been a bit of a reality check in that. Also, let's keep in mind that what you just described was very much the case up from the mid-70s to the mid-90s, because, as you mentioned, there was, since the mid-70s, the United States instituted the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, banning basically U.S. companies bribing abroad. Europe did not follow suit until basically the late 90s, when the OECD Convention comes into play. And the OECD Convention at first had its infant industry challenges, and it took its time to come on board. But by now it has become a serious framework. In the U.S., there is now, thanks to the Department of Justice and others, more resolve to follow on those cases of foreign corruption and Corruption Act. But I would also point out that so is the case in some other OECD countries, including the UK, for instance, to some extent also Germany, and certainly the Nordic countries. And so we would not want to suggest that the US is totally far ahead from any European country. Europe is very diverse, and of course the reality in Greece and in Liechtenstein is very different than in the Nordic countries, so it's important to also to differentiate that. But just like what happened with the FCPA, that then there was pressure, and it took a long time for the OECD convention to come into play, which by now it's becoming more effective. The same, in terms of your question, the same should be taking place in other aspects. The Dodd-Frank section that mandates transparency on the oil, gas, and mineral companies for companies listed in U.S. stock exchanges next that should happen in Brussels for the EU, because what you're saying is very important. The playing field needs to be leveled, so that to be fair. In corruption, foreign corruption, I think increasingly is being leveled. It's not perfect, but because of the OECD. But in terms of this issue of mandating transparency for the big companies, the U.S. has taken the lead thanks to the Dodd-Frank bill. But next, absolutely, there has to be pressure, and a lot of homework is going on in Brussels for the EU to adopt that. After that, has to go to Asia and the stock markets in Seoul, and maybe also in Taiwan, Shanghai should be next, and so on. So in that sense, you're right. It has to be rolled out to the world. We live in a globalized world. The playing field needs to be leveled.
Right. And I agree with you, as you mentioned, that Europe has to be differentiated because we know that the records for Nordic states, for UK and Netherlands, Denmark are much better than continental Europe. And also we have many examples where German companies, for example, and Austrian companies are still state-owned. Banking industry owned by local governments, where there is a interaction between the government and private sector, which does end in political corruption in the end, and which we have seen. So they haven't been really enforcing law, political corruption of those companies in Southeast Europe, unfortunately.
But you have done an excellent job in trying to communicate through your research and through this interview of how important it is for policymakers, for legislators, for citizens to be very much aware of what is happening in their respective countries, for us here in the United States as well as for countries in Europe. It's not just an isolated issue with seeing what happens in Greece. What happens in Greece affects the Eurozone. What affects the Eurozone affects us here in America. And I think what you've done and articulated is that we citizens and taxpayers ought to be more engaged. Media needs to be more engaged so that we prevent some of these things from happening. In fact, you've indicated with the Wall Street crisis how that basically, with the lack of oversight and the specific aspects of accountability and transparency, I think those are some of the real issues that ought to be in the forefront. In conclusion, I know we've got a lot of these challenges here. Do you remain optimistic about where we're headed as we look at some of these challenges and the solutions that you presented?
Cautiously so. We live in such a complex world. You both reminded me when saying also how can points of influence come in the good direction be applied to the whole world. So it's not just one country taking the lead and doing reforms. The innovations like the Group of 20, the evolution of the international NGO community, the international civil society, I think much more needs to be recognized, and how also they are collaborating with the media. So civil society, the bottom-up approach, participatory approach, and we saw it in the transition from socialism and now in the Arab Spring. And those are the youth movements, the entrepreneurship, and the combining with the IT revolution and this basically social network revolutions. Those are areas for enormous hope for the future, and they can play a very important role in enhancing accountability, improving governance, and also controlling corruption. So that's why I remain optimistic. We still need to be very frank about the challenges in terms of leadership in many countries remains flawed, subpar, particularly in the public sector. There is still corruption. Let's keep in mind, it's 2012. We are almost at the end. Europe still has a dictator. Has a full-time, full-fledged dictator in the name of Mr. Lukashenko in Belarus, who is tolerated and goes around like that. And I'm not even speaking about a managed move away from democracy, what's happening in Russia, which is a much more sophisticated move. But there is one full-time dictator, and this is in this era. So there are sovereign news. They still very significant areas of conflict. What's still happening in Syria is unspeakable, and the world is not acting. So that's a governance challenge for the world and not only for Syria. So what we're likely to see in the future is progress in some dimensions and in some countries, but it's a law of large numbers. Let's not be surprised by also failures and some countries going in the wrong direction. So we're going to see a mix. Europe has had a major challenge, a major virus because of the financial economic crisis. But something that is not said enough is that it has very strong institutions, which is a way in medical terms, has very strong antibodies. So it has a huge virus. But the antibodies that such a continent with such institution has make me be hopeful that, yes, they are passing through a very rough time. It will continue for a bit, but they'll get through these doomsday scenarios that are painted by pundits because it's good for the media. I don't necessarily buy them. I don't buy them for the United States either. So in that sense, I also remain hopeful. Let's keep in mind that in early 2009, we were, by looking at the abyss in the United States and in terms of the world financial situation. So people, yes, do complain, and rightly so. Unemployment is still high and so, but compare where we were. We have come out, and we are very far now from the crisis and the abyss where we were. And what we have not discussed is the emerging economy world, where there are enormous points of progress and showing the art of the possible, including Asia. Emerging Asia is becoming a giant. India and China has major challenges, but they are growing. And Brazil, my own country, Chile, it's a success story where nowadays lessons are being applied even in terms of pension systems and so on in rich industrialized countries. So that's another area of hope. And lastly, but not least, but then it's to go full circle, it's the belief in evidence-based analysis, evidence-based discussion, what I call the power of data. For too long, we went around just discussing the anecdote of the cab ride I took and I heard this or that. Nowadays, we have access to much more data. Let's use it. We need to convert it into user-friendly fashion and have a conversation that everybody can get involved. That's why these web-based tools with new ways of visualizing the data that we have put together here at Brookings for all these indicators, and we want to do much more. But I think we need to pay much more attention to the data. Get the data, and let's look at the data, because it can speak so many more mountains than just our words.
For our listeners, we would certainly encourage them to visit the website brookings.edu and certainly search for Dr. Daniel Kaufmann's writings and research and their interactive tools that they have, so that you at your home, at your office, at your educational institutions can be able to seek more information about how these solutions are making a difference. Dr. Kaufmann, I would like to thank you for your important insights into our discussion today. We look forward to learning more about the success stories coming out of emerging economies and for your country of Chile as well. And thank you indeed for taking time out of your schedule and being with us on America's Roundtable.
Thank you, Dr. Kaufmann.
Thank you, Joanne, Tasha. It was my pleasure.